We now move on to analysing part 2 of the novel The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Please pause and consider the understandings you've developed from the one chapter, part 1, Night. Think about those key themes and links that you made between our world and attitudes, relationships, theme of power and control, and the world of our protagonist as introduced in that first chapter. Think about some of the incongruence and the coupling of images and how they establish an unsettled or possibly disturbing atmosphere where it seems identity is based on group and category as opposed to individual preference and free will. Think about your responses to the questions we left you with for chapter 1 and part 1. And now we'll progress to part 2. Where part 1 was called Night, part 2 is entitled Shopping. Quite different associations. Part 2, Shopping, incorporates chapters 2 through to 6, and we'll be looking at a couple of chapters now. The title Shopping begins with the connotations of female stereotypes, but do challenge yourself to move beyond this. For what else do we shop or search? For what else are we looking to fulfill our lives? The setting is significant because part 2 moves us away from that populated gym, some time has passed, to the home quarters of the handmaids and their room. Consider what characterises this domestic sphere and the way that it has been purposely constructed to contain and exploit women. Point of view and characterisation, as in any novel, is significant, and now is the time to begin tracking the narrator's train of thought if you haven't already started this. Look at comparisons. Look at the socio-cultural commentary that she observes and that she forms. How does she set herself apart from others in her observations of her surroundings and the figures that she meets? And what is it about her that makes her seem different or unsatisfied with her identity, her prescribed identity? Again, the role of descriptive and emotive language is paramount. Annotate key phrases and images that convey more than a physical setting, though this is important. Perhaps it conveys an ideology or state of mind. After reading the chapter, as we did with chapter 1, answer these questions to consolidate your understanding. Firstly, at this stage in the novel, what do you understand by Aunt Lydia's remark that where I am is not a prison, but a privilege? And consider the way that term privilege possibly changes meaning depending on one's context. Question 2, consider the ways language itself and all its elements and devices can marginalise, exclude and diminish particular social groups. The narrator examines the derivation of the word fraternise, for which there is no equivalent feminine term. So can you think of other terms in the English language that still privilege maleness and render female other? One that comes to mind is the quite outdated term stud, which is quite a positive reflection a lot of young males anyway might consider. The only equivalent that still exists in the dictionary is spinster for a female, and this has very different connotations. It has connotations of failure, inadequacy, agedness, possibly rejection, as opposed to bachelor, which is another word that's used as an antonym or a synonym, a male synonym for the female spinster. This connotes the player type or popularity, control, multiple partners, all of which is valorised usually in our Western culture for a man, whereas the reverse is expected of a woman. And should she transgress those boundaries and take on some of these masculine traits that we've mentioned, she is largely punished socially and culturally. We'll talk more about that later. Thirdly, the reference to tokens and pictures of things they can be exchanged for, eggs, a piece of cheese, reveals what about the novel's setting or context? What expectations, assumptions, and understandings have you established based on chapters 1 and 2 that you will now carry into your reading of chapter 3? This is the significance of structure when we're looking at a novel. We don't come into each chapter neutrally. We have our own context that we bring, but we also bring our understandings that we've developed from previous chapters. We'll talk about readings and so forth a little bit later on. 5. Add to the similarities and differences between the protagonist's world and ours that you've established after reading chapter 1. How does Atwood convey the importance of the character, the commander, at the end of chapter 2 before we meet him? And how does this leave you feeling? What direct effects and ramifications can you already see of a world that privileges conformity, male authority, functional reproduction, and human survival over family? We'll return to these at the end of the chapter. Chapter 2 begins with a description of the setting. In staccato beat, a chair, a table, a lamp. Above on the white ceiling, a relief ornament in the shape of a wreath, and in the centre of it a blank space, plastered over, like the place in a face where the eye has been taken out. There must have been a chandelier once. They've removed anything you could tie a rope to. Time has passed since the gymnasium scene of chapter 1. Note the minimalist setting, the nondescript chair, table and lamp, all singular of course. Nothing evinces excess, luxury or sentimentality. There are no individual or personal touches that mark the room as the protagonist's own. Paragraph 1 pulls no punches with immediate reference to the central wreath and the removal of anything you could tie a rope to. Consider the connotations of each of these. The oppressive environment constructed in the gym in chapter 1 is concentrated in this description of the handmaid's room, a microcosm of the larger society with its accompanying attitudes. Chapter 2 is striking in its use of sensory imagery and personification, much more enlivened than the people themselves. Our protagonist watches air-moving curtains and sunlight falling on the floor. She smells wood polish and notices the fabric of the rugs and prints and paintings. And these are the very things that evoke memory for us, the sensory memories, sounds, smells and sights. The one-line paragraph 4, think of it as being in the army, is an evocative phrase. What requires defending? Who decides? It's their duty to serve. Is hardship a lesson in humility and knowing your place? And how does this conformity benefit the greater good? For what other reason would this be occurring? The questioning in the previous paragraph, a return to traditional values, waste not, want not. I'm not being wasted, so why do I want? Why do I feel I'm lacking? Why do I need and yearn? Serves to enhance the protagonist's questions later in the paragraph we just read. Does each of us have the same print, government issued? Nothing seems to hold aesthetic value anymore. Even the women are spoken and thought of as commodities. I'm not being wasted, so why do I want? Now to the bottom of the page. Diction again evokes images of discomfort, functionality, sterility, conformity, discipline, and the military. Even thought must be rationed. There is very little that is human in this room or her life, it seems. Shatterproof and partially open windows sustain the imagery established by the wreath in paragraph 1. These women are virtually institutionalised, used, then forgotten. Even the bed is only used for sleep, and leisure time is of no use. Individual thought is certainly perceived as a threat by those in power. You might be able to think of some other science fiction novels or speculative fiction that ask the same questions or that construct the same setting or context in which one regime, one government has stripped the people of their identity. Think about the expectations you now bring to the rest of this chapter and the novel. Paragraph 5 importantly reveals the narrator's resilience, determination and capacity for rational thought as she observes, thinking can hurt your chances and I intend to last. Pause to note any questions this raises for you, such as who is competing or what factors threaten their survival? What does she need to last or endure? The survivor or the underdog story is a common trope in science and dystopic fiction. So how does it engage us here? And for what reasons are we on her side? She states, "It isn't running away that they're afraid of. We wouldn't get far. It's those other escapes, the ones you can open in yourself, given a cutting edge." So what psychological escapes or emotional escapes or escapes in behaviour could give them a cutting edge, could promote individuality in such a conforming world? The next paragraph refers to women of reduced circumstances, and we ask immediately, reduced from what? Our present-day circumstances? Pause to list all of the freedoms, privileges and basic rights that have been stripped from these women. Likely these are freedoms and privileges and rights that we enjoy living in a Western society of democracy and free will. Despite the minimal decor and lack of human contact, our narrator is appreciative of small mercies, blessings and beauty, and this is one thing that sets her apart. "I am alive," she says. "I live, I breathe," she thinks, thus highlighting the oppressive attitudes, regulations and behaviours of the society in which she must survive. Why might Atwood emphasise this so early in the novel? And how is that positioning us to respond to the protagonist? The bell that measures time is ringing. Time here is measured by bells, as once in nunneries. As in a nunnery too, there are few mirrors. The sentences are repetitive. How does this reflect the meaning of those words and bringing that resounding bell that marks time monotonously to our minds? The bell that measures and controls even time breaks her out of her contemplation. This section of chapter 2 builds on the characterisation and setting established in earlier paragraphs in chapter 1. Consider the connotations of the terms nunnery, mirrors, flat-heeled shoes and prescribed issue. What are these elements and associations doing to these women? How is it making them feel? And how is it positioning us to view them? Highlight phrases that convey the expectations of the time and the narrator's attitudes and commentary. She writes, "Everything except the wings around my face is red, the colour of blood which defines us. The skirt is ankle length, full. The white wings too are prescribed issue. They are to keep us from seeing, but also from being seen. And seeing and perception is a key theme of the novel." Note further down the comments on red and blue and the connotations we have with these colours. Red here in particular, the colour of blood, as specified, but also what else we associate with that? We would associate passion, heat, warmth, connection, humanity, possibly danger or peril, and certainly loss of life. Positives and negatives. Consider the tone being used here and the symbolism of red here. And the fact that she says at the end of that paragraph, or she thinks, "I never look good in red. It's not my colour." She sets herself apart from the category defined by red. How is she not red or different from red? We'll talk about this later on when we finally learn her name. The passage goes on to describe the door of her room. Well, not my room, as she says, and it's not locked. It's the room of the house in which she inhabits, one room. Describe the significance and irony of the similes. Like a path through the forest, like a carpet for royalty, it shows me the way. To what way is this runner leading her or showing her? And what connection might that have with a forest? Consider fairy tale references here. The Victorian house is symbolic of traditional times with stricter and highly conventional attitudes, particularly towards gender roles, status, and social mores. Here the colours of red, and Little Red Riding Hood is evoked, and blue, blue blood or royalty, reflect values and attitudes and class. Consider the Little Red Riding Hood story, what the wolf represents, that masculine threat, the unknown, and the punishment of the female who steps out of place, who disobeys the rules, who challenges the status quo by venturing into that dark space that is not hers, not her domain. At the bottom of the page, the reference to the clock, the symbolic contrast between the grandfather clock, which controls time, just as the bell, and the motherly front sitting room of domestic inactivity and ornamentation is indicative of attitudes in this paradoxically conventional future time. Consider the use of those family terms and those associations to make this comparison, and what this also reveals about attitudes of the time. The reference to standing or kneeling in a sitting room is further indication of her position and sub-status, and therefore her perceived or attributed importance in society. And this is what she's facing and what she's fighting. Remembering that the red and blue signify class, but also hold many other connotations that you've recently written down. We move on to the next paragraph. There remains a mirror on the hall wall. If I turn my head so that the white wings framing my face direct my vision towards it, I can see it as I go down the stairs. Round, convex, a pier glass, like the eye of a fish, and myself in it like a distorted shadow, a parody of something, some fairy tale figure in a red cloak descending towards a moment of carelessness that is the same as danger. A sister dipped in blood. Notice the longer sentence in the centre there, almost a stream of consciousness as she's observing her surroundings and sharing her attitudes and her feelings as she does so. The narrator is enveloped by white wings and a red cloak, which again limit her vision, her seeing, her perception, and direct where she looks. Her vision is restricted, as is her role. Her former self seems fragmented and dissolving, her current identity determined by external forces. What does the distorted shadow, the parody of a fairy tale figure, and a sister, with its faith connotations, dipped in blood, evoke for you? Very strong images. From your perspective, how does this enhance key themes and characterizations, key representations of woman or the feminine, and key representations of power? In the next paragraph, there's further use of simile of the umbrella stand being shaped like the opening fronds of a fern. Lovely alliteration. This emphasises the diminishment of life, fertility, burgeoning sexuality and independence, all being stripped away. At the same time, using the conventional flower image to convey these ideas. And you might pause to briefly research that and look at how that has been a long-held symbol of womanhood and femininity and sexuality, and the ways that that can be taken, the ways that that can be controlled by male presence. We get reference to the commander's wife, and we hear her pacing back and forth, a heavy step and a light. Identity in the title Commander's Wife is determined by relationship to the male. So this denotes ownership, subjugation, and very clear attitudes, misogynistic attitudes towards gender role and identity. This is clearly a patriarchal hierarchy that controls the population of the society. Any previous name or identity seems to be ignored or devalued. And this harkens back to the end of chapter 1, where those whispered names were shared amongst the sisterhood of the women sleeping in the gym. Whispered, a secret not to be spoken aloud, a taboo topic. Consider where you stand on that topic or that theme of identity and how we like to express our identity very overtly, and these women are being suppressed and not permitted to do so. The protagonist walks along the hallway past that sitting room in which she stands or kneels only, and the door that leads into the dining room, and open the door at the end of the hall and goes through into the kitchen. And then the smells, the sensory imagery changes. Here she meets Rita at the kitchen table. This next section relays the presence of Rita, the cook and cleaner for the commander, that's been referenced, in the sterile and functional kitchen of the house. Not our usual associations of warmth and gathering, family gathering together at parties and so forth, to share, to experience, to contribute. A very different feeling here. Her dull surgeon-like gown eliminates femininity and foregrounds functionality. It too is long and concealing and reminiscent of a time before. Here, clothing, much like attitudes, remains conventional and prudish for the women. Consider again what attitudes and expectations there are very clearly of the women in this world. Also look at those religious connotations for the loaves and the bread that Rita is making, and the fact that she's categorised as a Martha. Incidentally, the 1950s name Rita signifies a pearl, something precious, and in biblical terms, Martha, sister of Mary of Bethany, represents service, the hostess, and practicality, but lacks true faith and reflection. She remained unconvinced regarding the teachings of Jesus and was wholly concerned with her hospitality and having her house just right and serving him with copious food and drinks and so forth, rather than Mary, in opposition, who sat and listened to Jesus' word and forwarded his teachings. Ironically, Rita, the Martha, is held up as the ideal in this world rather than Jesus' choice of Mary. So look up this narrative and note its significance to the storyline as we understand it so far. Religious belief and the use of it as a foundation for a governmental regime is highly significant as the novel continues. And as said, any warmer notions of sustenance and family often linked to bread making are eclipsed by imagery of service, civility and functionality once again. The top of the next page, interestingly, Rita's disapproval of the narrator and her symbolic red dress again suggest women's role in the subjugation of each other and of the power of the patriarchal hierarchy. So they're contributing to it, just as are the men. Consider the connotations here of disease and bad luck as one woman perceives another, and how these attitudes might have been shaped by the expectations in society in which they survive and exist at this stage, but also possibly shaped by a desire to survive themselves and to last, and perhaps by putting others down it increases their power and their chance for survival. A feminine stereotype here of gossiping and judgment. Once the protagonist hears Rita say to Cora, the other maid, the helper, that she wouldn't debase herself like that, being a handmaid. Nobody asking you, Cora said. Anyways, what could you do, supposing? Go to the colonies, Rita said. They have the choice. With the unwomen and starve to death, and Lord knows what all, says Cora. So Rita says to Cora that she wouldn't debase herself like that, and this raises questions regarding the status attributed to various roles within the community and the judgment that taints potential relationships. Handmaids are essential to humankind's survival, yet are viewed as morally bereft, the equivalent of sanctioned state prostitutes. They are valued for being able to bear children, but aren't treated with that respect. Cora goes on to say, anyways, they're doing it for us all. If I hadn't have got my tubes tied, it could have been me. Say I was 10 years younger. It's not that bad. It's not what you call hard work. Better her than me, Rita said, as our protagonist opens the door. The majority of the final part of Chapter 2 focuses on the Marthas and their gossip or unofficial news regarding the colonies, unwomen, can their identity be any more diminished, and crimes committed behind closed doors. Ironically, once despising idle gossip, The narrator now yearns for any connection or communication, any link to story or bonding or sisterhood. Cora's statement that they're doing it for us all and that it could have been her clearly indicates a context in which not all women reproduce, that the species is threatened and there is little choice in taking on the role. Obviously, we are still not sure what this role entails. Again here we see women trying to exert some semblance of power within their highly constricted world. Unfortunately, this disadvantages other women and perpetuates the very cycle and attitudes that disempower them. So consider the implications for women here. What options are available to them, if any? How are they able to attain some form of power within their limited roles, or not? And what fate lies in wait for them? How would you manage in a world of this sort? As we turn over the page, we see highlighted, we would exchange remedies and try to outdo each other in the recital of our physical miseries. I know what you mean, we'd say, or a quaint expression you sometimes hear still from older people. I hear where you're coming from, as if the voice itself were a traveller arriving from a distant place. As with Chapter 1, diction and imagery continue to play a significant role in shaping the reader's views of events and characters. Phrases including real coffee and quaint expressions, and similes such as like unruly children and mournful as pigeons further highlight the changed context and treatment of people. Again, women being linked with children and being viewed as substandard or inferior. Something to be controlled and kept in their place, seen but not heard, in a manner of speaking. Part of the unofficial news is them discussing the notion of a stillborn child and the crimes that some of the women, some of the handmaids, have committed. The dehumanisation of the novel's context is almost painfully conveyed through the protagonist's desperate hunger for touch, the very human need to feel connectedness and inclusion. To the protagonist, kneading bread dough is likened to squeezing flesh, and she longs to violate decorum and reach out to Rita. Conventional Rita disallows this, of course, and the protagonist doesn't tempt her to friendship. Pause to consider this further. Perhaps another way to read Rita's refusal or fear to fraternise is merely self-preservation and an indication of how she has successfully survived the current regime so far. Does this in fact suggest that within a strict patriarchy, this is the only means of power available to women, that they must conform to survive, that they are doomed to a life of control? Does Rita exert power in her small domestic domain? Is this at the expense of other women? It is quite shocking to read of women, people gossiping about stillbirth with no compassion. And there is that very sterile clinical tone to a lot of the speech in this science fiction world. This society of Gilead that has been in existence for about 18 months to 2 years at this stage of the novel, since the gymnasium scene. Is it also necessary to become desensitised to survive in this world? Clearly, there are many implications to consider. Note down your stance and your reading of Rita's character, particularly considering her environment. Lastly, the protagonist's reference to her past relationship with Luke is poignant, and clearly there are biblical associations here. Yet another aspect of life has been taken from our protagonist in this new world. Just as she offers specific details on her surroundings, the affection with which she delivers memories of Luke is significant in shaping our view of her character and of the importance of our past experiences in shaping us and of our yearning to remain connected to our families. She used to tease him about being pedantic, and we get a definite image of their closeness. Finally, our protagonist takes the tokens from Rita's outstretched hands. And here's the tokens that we spoke about earlier, that they could be exchanged for 12 eggs, a piece of cheese, a brown thing that's supposed to be a steak. So very specific, minimal numbers and description, and certainly not luxuries and excess. She places them in the zippered pocket in her sleeve where she keeps her pass. And again, we see all elements of control and identification in the hands of the regime. Rita says, "Tell them fresh for the eggs," she says, "not like last time. And a chicken, tell them, not a hen. Tell them who it's for, and then they won't mess around." "All right," I say. I don't smile. Why tempt her to friendship? And this is the reference to the commander, and look at the atmosphere that's being created here and the suggestion about his status and the power that he holds. So on completing this chapter, return back to those after reading questions, note down your answers and discuss those within your class, definitely keeping note of quotes as evidence of your views, and begin to consider prison versus privilege, fraternise versus sororicise, if that was a term. Look at who is privileged and who is rendered other, and how this is achieved through language and categorisation as much as rules, regulations and behaviours, and certainly the societal structure itself, and to whom it endows power and how that perpetuates, and the role of those within that structure. And then finish by noting down the understandings that you have developed in Chapter 2 and what you'll carry with you into Chapter 3. And then move on to the tutorial for Chapter 3.